The loudest voice of dissent among Yugoslavia's leaders was punished today. Vuk Drašković, the deputy prime minister who suggested compromise with NATO, lost his job. At the same time, the authorities in Belgrade were clamping down on the reporting of a BBC interview with a former general who called for President Milosevic to be replaced. NATO seized on the Drašković dismissal as evidence of the Yugoslav leadership beginning to fracture. Earlier, the alliance apologized for one of its missiles drifting off target and causing civilian casualties in a residential area of southern Serbia. John Simpson is in Belgrade, where the authorities are monitoring everything he does. We're sorry about the poor sound in his report.
Vuk Drašković has been a loose cannon inside President Milosevic's government since the start of the year. But now he's out of it altogether, thanks to his complaints that the government was lying about casualty figures and his proposal that NATO troops might be part of a future UN presence in Kosovo.
Our obligation, state obligation, is to accept a resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations, and finally the Security Council of the United Nations will decide the composition of such possible UN international forces in Kosovo.
But even when Mr. Drašković was leading the protests against President Milosevic, he was always a Serb nationalist. He's no sympathizer with NATO now, yet his political instincts are good, and he knows President Milosevic may soon be in trouble. Vuk Drašković is booking a place in whatever system will follow.
There are definitely starting to be political stirrings here. Partly it's because many politicians can sense at least the possibility of a coming deal, brokered by the Russians and the United Nations. Partly it's because they're just beginning to think about the question of what will happen after the conflict's over, and they want to be a part of that process. Most opposition politicians here feel they've got to be extremely careful about the way they put themselves forward at the moment. It can be quite dangerous. But there is one exception.
His name is Vuk Obradovic. He's a former general, and he's the leader of the Social Democracy Party. We interviewed him yesterday, and he was startlingly outspoken, saying that President Milosevic was the problem of the democratic forces in Serbia who were going to get rid of him. We've been banned from broadcasting the interview. Today, perhaps in order to protect himself against official retribution, the general sent a letter to General Wesley Clark of NATO, protesting strongly about the deaths of civilians in the NATO bombing of Surdulica yesterday. But speaking as one general to another, he said peace talks should be resumed with a cool head. NATO has spoken of one bomb going astray in Surdulica, but Western journalists who were taken there by the Serbian authorities said they saw signs of two big explosions a quarter of a mile apart. There does seem to be a change of attitude here. Disasters like this, which have happened several times now, appear to be making people long for an end to the war, rather than making them angry, as they used to. John Simpson, BBC News, Belgrade.
And Mark Leahy joined us now from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Mark, these signs of dissent in Belgrade, NATO must be praying for them to spread, but do they have any intelligence about how serious they actually are?
They've got a certain amount. I mean, they know obviously what we've seen, but also they are getting good intelligence on the rate of desertions, draft dodging, the house arrest of various generals. So they think that there's multiple signs of the thing beginning to crumble, but equally they're not making too much of it. They're saying it's a resilient system. President Milosevic is able to clamp down on it hard. So they're seeing it as straws in the wind of what will happen eventually, but they're not saying that the whole thing is going to crumble inevitably. But they're encouraged by it, no question about that, but they're not over-encouraged, they're not playing it up to the point of thinking that defeat is imminent.
But just as these Serb voices are being raised, NATO goes and kills 16 Serb civilians. That couldn't have been much help to the cause.
No, it isn't, but equally NATO fronted up to it immediately it happened. There wasn't any repetition of the attack on the convoy, which stretched out over a week. Within a day they had admitted to it fully, saying that one bomb had gone astray. They also acknowledged that another one might have, but they know for certain that one did. And they've also put out the standard argument they do, which is that They try hard. The precision-guided weapons are very accurate, but they're not 100% accurate. Some will miss, some will kill civilians. It's happened before, and it will happen again. But they're saying they do their best, but people have to live with the fact that this is a war, and these things happen. They'll just try hard as they can.
Out of the internet has come some information which may throw new light on the Kosovo peace plan that never was at the Rambouillet talks. An interim agreement that the Serbs wouldn't sign has turned up on a Balkan website whose origins are slightly obscure, but anyway, it's there. And it suggests that the deal would have allowed NATO troops to move freely across Yugoslavia, not just in Kosovo. Now, that is a plan that the Serbs could never have accepted from the outset. The 90-page document wasn't made public at the time. Here's an extract from it.
NATO personnel shall enjoy, together with their vehicles, vessels, aircraft and equipment, free and unrestricted passage and unimpeded access throughout the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, including associated airspace and territorial waters. This shall include, but not be limited to, the right of bivouac, manoeuvre, billet and utilization of any areas or facilities as required for support, training and operations.
Well, the German Parliament discussed parts of this document last week. One of the concerned members of the governing SPD in the Bundestag, Hermann Scheer, says that if the details had been known earlier, many people in his party wouldn't have supported the NATO bombing.
Some colleagues say if they would have known the real state of development of the Rambouillet negotiation process, they would not have supported the bombing attacks.
Well, Dr. Jonathan Isle of the Royal United Services Institute, who understands these things intimately, offered me this interpretation earlier.
That effectively the demands that were placed on President Milosevic were much more onerous than were described at the time. Effectively, as Milosevic saw it, this entire agreement posed him with two options. Either he accepted to lose Kosovo peacefully, or he had to lose it by force, and predictably he chose force.
Do you think, from a Western point of view, an acceptable presence could have been negotiated without the provision that proved unacceptable to the Serbs? In other words, could a deal have been done on a different basis which would have avoided the bombing?
Well, in theory, yes. In practice, no. Let us not forget that the Rambouillet Accords came after we already had a botched deal negotiated by the Americans last October. So there was the logic behind the insistence of the West that this time there would be a NATO-led force, and that this force would be introduced into the province, and that it would be allowed the blank check to do as it pleased.
But it must have been known to the State Department and to other Western governments that the kind of deal that was on the table at Rambouillet was much less likely to be acceptable than we outside thought was the case at the time.
Indeed, and it was worse than that. President Milosevic was reassured when he decided to go to the peace conference at Rambouillet that only documents agreed by the contact group, which included Russia, would be tabled there. The military protocol about which we're talking now was not approved by Russia. Nevertheless, it was enforced on him. The assumption was that President Milosevic was cornered and that ultimately he was bluffing and will have to accept, and if not, drop a few bombs on him and he'll return to the negotiating table.